Moving on up the line with concept 34.3, we're up to the vertebrates. Vertebrates are craniates that have a backbone in addition to the other features that we talked about. During that Cambrian period, a lineage of craniates began to evolve and became what is now considered the vertebrates. Vertebrates became more efficient at capturing food and avoiding being eaten, two very important things if you want to stay alive and pass on your genes, due to their more complex nervous system and more developed and elaborate skeletons. As these creatures developed a vertebrae, and then in addition to the vertebrate, they developed additional skeletal bones that allowed for greater amounts of movement and strength. They also developed along with that a greater and more complex nervous system. So this kind of progression of complexity kind of continued on with the addition of the vertebrae. Derived characters of vertebrates would include a couple of different things. So after vertebrates branched off from other craniates, they underwent yet another sort of mutation, a gene duplication involving a particular family of transcription factors. So again, we see another good example of how mutations, although mutations themselves are random, the selective pressure of natural selection is not random. It's completely non-random. It is very regimented. And so you have these random mutations, but then the ones that are beneficial are selected for by the environment, by the various environmental pressures, and those are the ones that end up getting passed on to future generations. So we have another example of that in the vertebrates. Vertebrates have the following derived characters, including all the ones we've already mentioned, but they have a vertebrae enclosing a spinal cord, so that would be more similar to, say, a human, you and I, an elaborate skull, and if we're talking about aquatic vertebrates, they have fin rays. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And if you've ever seen like a regular fish, a bass or a catfish, you know the fin rays that we're talking about. So here we are. Again, you don't have to know all of these names. More important to look at the various categories like craniate, vertebrate, chordate. I'm more concerned with you knowing those categories of creatures, and then maybe some of the more common examples, maybe the ones that you've heard of before. So lampreys are going to be the most basic of the vertebrates that we're going to talk about. Lampreys represent the oldest living lineage of vertebrates. They are jawless vertebrates that feed by clamping their mouth onto a live fish. They're kind of a parasitic creature, kind of a scary looking creature. I'll show you a picture in just a moment. They inhabit various marine and freshwater habitats. They have a cartilaginous segment surrounding the notochord and arching partly over the nerve cord. So this would be a vertebrate, but a very simplistic version of, and here's what that little guy looks like. So he is a lamprey, and here is his mouth. Whoops, sorry about that. Keep accidentally hitting the wrong button. So here's a lamprey, and here is his mouth, kind of a scary looking round plunger of teeth and suckers, and he attaches to other fish and actually kind of chews on them and sucks fluid from them. So he's kind of a parasitic creature. Fossils of early vertebrates, the very first vertebrates had skeletal parts usually associated with the mouth. When we first start to see skeletons, bones and mineralized portions, a lot of these creatures sort of had a skeleton, but it was made out of cartilage. It wasn't mineralized, and when they first started showing some of this mineralized skeleton, it was pretty much associated first with the mouth, the jaw, the teeth, that area, and it seems to have then begun to evolve to develop into further parts of the body. The fossilized dental elements, so the fossilized teeth of these very early creatures called conodonts, were the very first vertebrates, and you can find really the only bone type structure on them was around the mouth, sort of the mouth, jaw, teeth type area there. So that would have been the very first kind of mineralization of a skeletal system. Further creatures kind of continued this trend of evolving hard, bony plates and skeletal type systems. Other armored, jawless vertebrates had defensive plates of bone on their skin. So you started to see this spread, this kind of evolutionary advantage of having kind of a skeletal system, or these bony either outer coverings, kind of armor coverings, or this internal system that provided for better movement and provided protection for a more complex nervous system. Of course, nowadays when we think of a skeletal system, we think of kind of like a picture that you see below. Here's the skeletal system of a horse, and there's a skeletal system of a man riding on the horse. We think of an entire internal full skeleton. That's not really how it began. It began most likely with mouth parts, so jaws and teeth, and then over time, over a long courses of time, we're talking millions of years of evolution, mineralization began to become a greater and greater part of the endoskeleton of some of these creatures. So the vertebrate endoskeleton that we think of today would have originally kind of been more of a cartilaginous type skeleton, kind of like what you still see in some creatures like sharks. And then that mineralization, the hardening and becoming bone like you're familiar with today, that took place over a long period of time. It was not just one day they had no skeleton and the next day they did. It was an evolutionary process that took quite a bit of time, and there was some stops and starts along the way as well. Alright, so we're going to stop right there, and then we're going to move on and continue. We're going to go to the next category, which would be vertebrates that have jaws. So you notice like the lamprey that we looked at, he's a vertebrate, but he doesn't have the type of jaw structure that we think of with most vertebrates. So we're going to move on and add jaws to our vertebrates, and then we'll talk about those. Those would be the gnathostomes. That's hard to say because the G is silent. Gnathostomes. Those are vertebrates that have jaws. We'll pick it up right there.